Hey guys, today we're going to discuss some of the best practices when doing a brake job. Today's video we're going to go over practices that I've used and learned over the years. I am not a mechanic, but we are using tried and true methods. Now, this truck we've owned for about 14 years, and these rotors we've logged on about 160,000 kilometers. They have been turned once, and they've gone through about 4 or 5 sets of brake pads. Now, the reason why we've been able to get away with so much mileage on this truck is this truck doesn't really tow. It goes on family trips and it goes to and from work, but we don't really weigh it down. I do like to purchase vehicles that are overbuilt for what I'm doing because then I get longer life out of them. Always perform all the safety precautions. So secure the wheels, put the vehicle in the park or into gear, and apply the parking brake. We're also using jack stands along the frame, and we're also putting the wheels underneath the vehicle just in case. Before you start cracking the tools out, familiarize yourself with the procedure. So get yourself a service manual specifically for your vehicle, because there's lots of information that's very specific to a vehicle that might be odd that you'll find. So like here, for the guide pins on the 2005 1500 model, which is what we have, it requires 74 foot-pounds. A lot of people, when I would say in other videos, thought that was really high, but it's right here in the service manual. Also here, when we look at our pad for our rotor prep, they recommend that we don't use aerosol brake cleaner. They want us to actually use soapy water to remove the residue off of the rotors. You'll also want to use proper protection, so use eye protection. And also use gloves to cover your hands. Now, before starting the brake job, I'm going to do this part first because I don't care about the pads or I don't care about getting anything on these old rotors. I'm going to take the time and I'm going to rust proof the frame components with fluid film. I use fluid film because it's safe on plastics. So I'll spray it on the bushings, I'll spray it on all these critical structural points to keep them fresh. So we go inside the frame, on the frame, just in these key areas while I have everything apart. What I'll also do is take the time now, because it's kind of messy, I'm going to grease all the chassis components. So I have upper and lower ball joints, and I have tie rod ends, and I also have sway bar bushings, all with grease fittings. Next, we'll just quickly clean off the brakes. And we can go ahead and turn the wheel to make life easier so we can access all the hardware. So this is a floating caliper setup. So we're going to remove the bolts going to the guide pins. Now we regularly service these guide pins. I try to do it at least once a year or even before a long trip. So I don't put any anti-seize or anything on these bolts because they are removed regularly. So now I recommend that you guys get one of these tools specifically for calipers. You'll see why later on. You can use bungee cords or wire, but when we go to push the pistons in, you'll see why this tool is so much better for the job. So go through the caliper first, hang it on the upper A-arm, holds it in place, no stress on this brake line, make sure it doesn't move, and we can go ahead and remove our pads. So I was inspecting these and I knew I had to add a brake job coming up, but we can see that we're getting down pretty low. So we plan to go on some trips this summer. Now's a good time to remove all this. So the bracket that holds the calipers on requires a bit more persuasion. So the bracket that holds the caliper on requires a bit more persuasion. So I'm going to put an extension on so I clear the brake line. Now don't take any of the brake hardware out. Leave everything in so you have a point of reference. Do a quick inspection. Does everything look okay? We're gonna put all new parts in though, because we have all the parts worth it. The only thing we're using are the bolts. Sometimes the rotor may be fused to the hub. This one's not. We had the hubs, though. Sorry, we had the wheel bearings changed recently on this truck last year or 2 years ago. So you might have to knock it with a mallet to get it loose. If you put a little bit of grease, like brake grease, just around it, then it's definitely going to come off a lot easier. So we got our bracket on the bench now. Look at your brake hardware. Every vehicle's be a bit different. This truck's really easy. So everything is identical. So I'm just marking and looking at the orientation. I know how it has to go back together. So we can take this all apart. I would never reuse these. Always just put new ones in. And because we service it regularly, it's not bad in here. But we're going to brush it all out. I would wear a respirator right now or something because brake dust is very bad for you. We see mostly just brake dust coming off. It's really clean, no scaling of rust or anything. Not worried about that. So we're going to take our guide pins out. We're going to inspect them. Now, because we service these regularly, I don't mind reusing them. If they look really good, I see no issue. Now, if it's pitted or there's damage, replace. Or if you had a hard time taking it out, this is all corroded in here in the threads, replace it. But if you can clean them off and they look good, and you can just re-grease them, you can get more life out of them. And maybe just change them every so many years. So the boots are actually okay on this, but we're going to change them out. We'll give these a better clean, but I'm just doing this to inspect it. So we have a little bit of staining that's not pitted. So let's look at the new boots for the guide pins. So we can see that there's metal on them, so we're gonna have to press these in. I don't think you should hammer them in because if you're trying to hammer at it, you could damage the boot as opposed to just one swoop use of the press. But we have to get the old ones out. So I just use this little chisel here that's usually used for removing gasket material. And then just lightly tap it with a hammer. And now's the time to really get the gunk out of the bore. Like if you can get a pipe cleaner of some sort. I'm just gonna wrap this Robertson screwdriver. It's a little more of a blunt edge and get it in there. You see all that stuff coming out. So be thorough, get everything out of there on both ends. So our caliper bore is all clean. I'm just using a little bit of the synthetic brake grease on the outside to aid me with installation. And I'm just going to line it up here on the press as evenly as I can. Watch your fingers. Position. I figure one good squish from the boot is better than constantly impacting it with a hammer of some sort, even if you use a block of wood. There you go. Make sure it's seated all the way, and repeat on the other end. So the bracket all clean. I'm just going to add a little bit, a thin layer of grease on both ends to act as a corrosion inhibitor and also reduce noise. You don't need much. Now, I never used brake hardware that was coated like this. Usually it's just it looks like there's stainless underneath it. This could just be for the installation process. I'm sure that seats nicely. So we're using soapy water as per recommendation of the manufacturer. You have to make sure you get that anti-corrosion coating off because you want the pad material, especially ceramic, we need the pad material to transfer over to the rotor correctly. That's a big urban myth with rotors when you get that warp feeling. If you look at Rebestos' site, they say it's actually an urban myth because for rotors like this to warp, for this steel of this thickness to warp, it would take so much heat. What it is you could have an uneven amount of pad material transferred over to the rotor, giving that sensation. Now, there are scored rotors, and we can see wear marks on them, but do your research on that because proper disc or rotor prep is essential to doing a brake job. This part's optional. I'm going to put on the thinnest layer of brake lubricant on the inside on the mating surface to help with corrosion, to help the rotor not stick to the hub. Just a little bit. You do not want it goopy on there because if it's goopy, it might start flinging around and you don't want that. While we're here, we might as well prep the surface for the hub. It has to be completely flat. So you might have to scrape off any scaling, take a brush to it, which does work for the most part, but it's really hard to get into these little tight spots. 3M makes these tools that go in your drill, so it accommodates the lug. Now you have a really nicely prepped surface. Now, if this was scaled, we'd have to go at it more, but at least around here, that's easy. Then you can come in these areas with the brush, or whatever tool, other tools you have. Okay, everything's clean. We're gonna do our best not to touch the main surface of the rotor. If you're going to, probably, it doesn't really matter too much. Just make sure you clean it good afterwards. Now we can go ahead and put on our bracket. So I know that this bracket is good. We visually inspect it for cracks. The threads are good because I can get these bolts in almost all the way in by hand. Everything feels smooth. Now, if these weren't threading in correctly, like it felt bad, and something looks damaged on the threads, replace the bolts, replace the bracket. Don't even second guess it. Don't second guess safety items like this. You might as well torque it on now so we don't forget. I've already changed my torque setting to the specification the manufacturer recommends. And it can vary by year, so maybe you did a 2003, but now you're doing a 2005. It could change, so please verify. Now, if you are going to reuse your rotors because you think they are in good condition, they look good, and you want to get them turned, you still need to make sure that you hit the minimum of thickness. So we can see here that the manufacturer wants 23 millimeters. Here it's at 24. Now we have to factor in also that you might have excess material here. So after it's done being turned, have the shop make sure that you're within the minimum spec. All right guys, so I'm gonna show you why this tool for the brake holder is so useful. This is on bungee cords, this would be super loose. So this step, I guess would be optional as well, but we have to compress the pistons in regardless because everything's thicker now. The rotor's a little bit thicker, the pads are thicker. So we're going to brake caliper tool into position. Get all the way in there. Because we have a dual piston setup, so be careful, make sure we're actually getting on both of them. Okay, just expanding enough so it holds. So when you push it back, you'll push back regardless, but then this area gets hot, the fluid can get all acidic, and then you could be pushing it back into your system, and you could be causing more harm to like the ABS module and things like that. So a simple thing we can do is put our brake bleeding kit on now, crack open the bleeder. But here's the nice thing, like this tool here helps me hold everything in place. So I'm not messing around so much. Everything's in the right orientation. Watch you guys see the hose. So now you see I'm pushing the fluid out through here. Now we bleed this truck regularly, so this fluid actually looks decent. It's just brown. A lot of times you do this on a vehicle that's been neglected and it comes out black. Cool. Okay, go ahead and tighten this. We're still going to bleed the brakes after. But this makes installation a lot easier. So I'm putting a little bit of brake lubricant on the pistons where they touch the pads. And just a little bit to the mating surface. And then the pad itself, I'm just going lightly over here. I've already done it on the actual hardware, but we'll just go a little bit there to help reduce noise. Please refer to your service manual. There may be an inner and an outer. And we want to apply a little bit of brake grease to the guide pins, reinstall them into the boots. So they should move freely. Now this backing plate, make sure you're going over it. Don't force your caliper back on because it'll damage it. And you might have to push the guide pins into place. And go ahead and line up everything. And then start putting in your hardware. So I don't put anti-seize on because I don't want it to back out, and I don't put thread lock on because I don't want them to be really difficult to change out over time. So I find if you just service your brakes regularly, you don't have to do that stuff on these components. So shimmy it all into place. Make sure it threads in really easy by hand. If it doesn't, get new guide pins, even new bolts, or if you had a hard time taking out those bolts and you rounded it a bit, just replace them. It's going to make it easier for you doing your next brake job or someone else doing the next brake job. Just go ahead and snug them down. I'm also looking at the boot, making sure it stayed in place. You don't want to get debris getting in there as you're driving. Change your torque setting because it's different for the bracket versus it is on the caliper itself or the guide pins. So I've already changed that. Now you can turn the wheel back and bleed it. It's also a really good idea to put fresh fluid in. So what we're doing here is we have to read the owner's manual or the cap. This particular truck takes .4, my truck took .3. So there's different ways you can do this. So we want to pull out as much of the fluid out of the reservoir, but leaving a little bit so we don't dry the system. That way it's going to be easier to bleed and we have fresh fluid going through. So I like to use some sort of vacuum bleeder like this because it's less mess, but you could use a syringe if you'd like to. So make sure that you have a rag near you and be able to clean the paint right away in case you spill anything. Brake fluid is very corrosive and bad for the paint. That's why using something like this is a little bit on the sketchy side because a lot of fluid can still pour out of it easily. So what I'm doing here is I'm topping off the master and putting the cap back on to make sure we don't have any spillage during the bleeding process. Also during the bleeding process, I'm starting at the furthest wheel, working my way up closest to the master. So this will vary depending on the vehicle. So if you have a vehicle that's a left-hand drive, we're going to start over there. If it's a vehicle that's right-hand drive, we're going to start over here. It really just depends on the placement of where that master cylinder is and how long each line is. So typically you can do some sort of bottle that has a tube going in all the way and recesses into the bottle. I prefer this tool because I don't have to use used fluid or new fluid because I have a valve here. So we're going to crack this open. So Craig, I want to get you to pump up the brakes for me. So he's going to pump up the brakes and then he's going to hold. Watch this line because we're going to see if there's any bubbles that come out. Okay, you holding? Okay, holding. So you see a bunch of bubbles come out. So you see there's bubbles down here. So the nice thing about the valve is the valve will hold the fluid in here. We don't care about what's happening over here, but that way it can't backtrack and push the bubbles back into the system. I'm still cracking it open and closing it right away just in case, but this is a lot easier for me to watch. Okay, go ahead and pump it up again. Now some vehicles you might have to bleed the ABS system and put it into a mode where it actually bleeds through a scan tool or run the engine like in my 350Z video. So we're going to crack it open again, watch the line. So that time we had no bubbles come through, so we're looking really good. So I'm going to go back up to the master and double check it. Read your owner's manual because depending on how the manufacturer laid out the brake lines, that order could change. Also, this is a very old truck, it just has ABS. Some vehicles actually you need to go into a scan tool and put them into a service mode. So you need to read all those things. I'm just going to run the engine to make it easier to push in the pedal, and it's also going to make sure that the ABS pump is pumping as well. Okay, let's go ahead and start the vehicle. So we're going to pump it about 5 to 10 times. So my operator is now pushing and holding. We're going to crack open the bleeder. Watch the line. So you see a little bit of bubbles in there. We're going to pump it up again. Feeling better? So I'm asking my operator, how is the pedal feeling? This is giving us indication if we're on the right track or if there's something else wrong with the system. You holding? So as they're holding the brake, I open up the bleeder, the pedal will push the fluid out and I close it right away, then we go ahead and pump again. While you're doing this, when you're letting that brake fluid go out, make sure you come and check the reservoir. Make sure it doesn't get too low. You're gonna have to start all over again. Now before we put the wheel back on, we want to do one last visual inspection since we've bled the brakes and we put pressure on the system. Because you had the caliper over here, something might have got damaged or maybe it's just old. So we're checking the brake line, making sure that there's no leaks. It is a bit harder to detect cracks or damage on a stainless steel braided line, but we have good pressure, everything looks good on it. We're also checking around the fittings, making sure that there's no fluid that leaked out. And we're just gonna go do one last clean of the rotor, making sure we have everything off of it on the friction contact patch. So we're going to also rotate it. And you want to feel like a light drag on the rotor. You want to make sure there's no excessive play on anything because the pad does have to touch the rotor a little bit, especially when it's new. And just quickly walk down the caliper. And you've double checked and you verify that you've torqued everything to the manufacturer specification on the brake assembly. Now we go ahead and put back the wheel on. Now before you put all the weight back down onto the wheel, go ahead and torque it to manufacturer specifications. So I have some weight on it. We're going to crisscross pattern. And the reason why this is really important is because the wheel helps hold the rotor onto the hub. So we want this to be as even pressure as possible. Now, not only do we have to go for a test drive and make sure everything works, we also have to make sure that we bed in the pads properly. So you can find a bunch of these articles, but this one's from AutoZone. So it's asking, is there a break-in procedure? And it says the answer is yes, but it's a complicated answer. So if you look here, if you drive it really nice and slow and you're very gradual on your brakes, the brakes will bed in naturally. But if you want to get the best performance possible, it's best to do this procedure right off the bat. So I'll put this link in the description below, that way you guys can read it for yourselves. So what it's saying here is that we're going to do pad transfer, because what happens is when you bed in pads to the rotors, you're depositing the pad material onto the rotor. So when there is that brake pad material on the rotor and the brake pad itself creates a lot of friction. If it's just a bare rotor and a brake pad, it's not nearly as good. So that's basically what this is saying. And what happens is, let's say we had brand new brakes and we got on the brakes really hard, got them really hot. You might have uneven distribution of the pad material. So what that says right here is creating an uneven surface on the rotor. And then it would be diagnosed as a warped rotor when it's actually not. But you probably have to get them turned anyways to remove the material. So we'll go over the procedure. So where it says here's pick a spot that's safe, accelerate to 35 miles per hour, and apply moderate brake pressure and reduce your speed to 5 miles per hour. Repeat as necessary. Repeat the process 2 to 3 times. Accelerate back to 35 miles per hour, moderately braking, and then test again at 55 miles per hour, back down to 5. You don't want to engage the ABS, but you should be able to come down pretty quickly. So you do that a few times, and you're going to transfer the material from the pads onto the rotor, and then you'll have really good braking performance. So we get the truck up to 35 miles an hour, roughly about 50 kilometers, moderately brake, get down to 5. Moderately brake. Get up to 55. very light on the brake pedal, just touching it. So the test drive proved very successful, smooth operation, brakes grabbed really well. So the indicator for me was the squealers on the pads were just starting to touch, and because of the slotted rotors, I would start to hear like a tick, 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 tick sound. So it kind of led me to believe like I knew I was gonna have to change brake rotors and pads this summer, but the truck was really talking to me. And remember, if you don't schedule the maintenance for your vehicle, the vehicle will schedule the maintenance for you. Don't worry about it. So you guys probably are wondering, when I pulled back in, you'll see that I don't have my lug covers back on quite yet, because what I like to do is after a quick test drive, I like to come back and retorque the wheels just in case something might have backed off a little bit, or because we were rotating it, it's now seating a little bit better. So you see this one, I had a couple turns on that. So you can see I'm getting a few turns out of them, even though we just torqued them down. But it's probably because we just had the new rotor on there, it didn't seat all the way. And even if you don't like to do your own brake job, a lot of times these shops, I don't blame them, they will torque these wheels on so tight because it's faster for them. They'd rather be over tight and stretch things versus having a wheel fall off. I get it. So what I like to do is, if I have a shop work on the vehicle, back off on the lug nuts, retorque it to spec, drive it around a bit, test it, then come back and retorque again. Now when it comes to what kind of fluid, I like to use Lucas products, but the more important thing is what type. So I use .3. A lot of people will say, well, you can use .4 because it has a higher boiling point. I suppose so, but the truck was designed for .3. Also, if you use a type of brake fluid that's higher in temperature, it also has the ability to pull more moisture in the system, so you would have to change it more often. This is a daily driven truck. It was designed to use this kind of brake fluid, so to keep up with my maintenance, I just continue to use it. These are the brake pads I'm using on the truck. I always trust Akebono. I've just always used it on the truck. I use it in my car. I've always been happy with the stopping power, especially when we get them hot, and also how much little brake dust that they emit because they are ceramic. The rotor we decided to go with is AC Delco Professionals, and this is their heavy duty series. So this is what they would use, or their extreme duty. This is what they would use for tow packages and things like that. So I would decide to try these out. This is something that a police vehicle would use, like a police Tahoe would be very similar. I have seen a different version where there are cut veins in it to help with cooling, but I think this style rotor, slotted or the little veins, is the best type of rotor for durability. Some people like to run slotted and drilled. Well, one, if you think about it, those slots reduce surface area, and so do the drills. So when you cross drill and you add slots, you're effectively losing contact patch. So on initial bite, technically a rotor like this would have the best initial bite because it has the most surface area. My second choice, or my other choice, would be slotted rotor. So on my car, I will be eventually running slotted rotors. Probably on my next truck, I'll run slotted again, but I want to give these guys a go. Well, there you guys have it. Brakes are not hard to do, but there's obviously some things that we have to take in consideration, like how do we clean the mating surface between the hub and the rotor? How do we push in the pistons on the caliper? What do we do about that brake fluid? And when we have it all back together, are we cleaning everything out, like the guide pins, the bores for the guide pins? Are we making sure that that's free of all debris so they can move smoothly, and then torquing everything down to manufacturer specification, not just torquing it tight and you think that's it. Really look at what the manufacturer has designed the whole system to do, because this is a system, and when you assemble it how they want it, it's going to work better and last longer, and the main thing is it's going to be safer.